Welcome to the latest edition of our Talk Death video series, where you get the chance to ask experts your questions about all things death and dying.
A reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel and to follow us on Instagram at TalkDeath Daily for your daily dose of death positivity.
Today's guest is Cassandra Yonder, a fellow Canadian advocating for community-centered death care. Cassandra wants to encourage cultural re-engagement with dying, death care, and grief.
Cassandra runs one of the largest Facebook groups dedicated to alternative death care practices, as well as deathcaring.ca, a virtual school for community death caring. Check out the description below to learn more about Cassandra and deathcaring.ca.
Welcome, Cassandra.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Tanya McGuinty from Facebook wants to know, what are the main areas where Canadians are lagging or more advanced when it comes to reclaiming death care?
I went to do a talk in Cape Breton one time, and I went to sort of a pretty remote region of Nova Scotia, and I was at a retirement facility, and they asked me to talk about, I was calling myself a practicing death midwifery at the time. And so I started talking about, and there was the uncomfortableness around the words, but when they kind of relaxed and got into what I was saying, they were just still really confused. Why was I talking about home funerals and how is this a movement? And finally I realized it's because they were like, well, yeah, I mean, that's how we do it. That's how we've always done it. Like, what is this newfangled thing? And even more than that, they actually were trying to get away from it. Because, and I feel like if you look at sort of the Industrial Revolution, this is sort of what happened, right? Is that as we specialized and compartmentalized our jobs, we're handing off the dirty business to other people, to professionals. We're parceling up life and not doing the things that we don't want to do. So I feel like there's still places that practice community death caring that wish they didn't have to. You know, people that don't want to have hands-on care for their dead. They wish that they could afford to hire a funeral director to do it for them, but they can't. So one thing that I think the movement can benefit from right now and does is just hearing these stories. And like you said about just saying the words out loud, but the way that we sort of reclaim birth, I think in a way, is to bring birth stories back into our culture, back into our society. And I feel like now we're starting to bring death caring stories back into our society. So I love just hearing about what it was like when people realize that they don't have to be all hush hush about death. They can say, well, I was at my grandpa's deathbed and, you know, this is what it was like for me and this is what it was like when he died, and talk to their kids about it. So in Canada specifically, I think one big advantage we have is a national organization. There's Community Death Care Canada, which is a national organization that's based on a community of practice model, which I think is really special because the way this movement is developing around the world is holding a really huge question mark and a lot of tension around the whole idea of professionalization. Like, who are these people that are stepping forward to provide service, and how is that being framed? How is it being credentialed? How is it being talked about? But in Canada, we have a national organization that's a community of practice model. So we say people can self-identify. You can come forward and say, these are my skills. This is the training I've taken, and this is what I have to offer. So through transparency, we can connect the public with those people who have a practice that they're willing to share and make offerings to the public. And I feel like that's a really big treasure, just in the whole way that capitalism and the economy and society works these days. So I personally hope that we don't go too far down this professionalization route, because I think the community of practice model holds great potential to frame this practice and to make it available and to legitimize it and to validate it the way that practitioners and the public want to see it. So those are two big advantages in Canada. One more thing that comes to mind is that when I was working with the National Home Funeral Alliance, noting the work that they were doing in the United States and the tension, the mounting tension that was growing between the home funeral movement and the funeral industry, just was really hard to witness. It's really difficult. I think it's really painful from both sides. And I think in Canada, we might have been a little bit more successful in being able to learn from some of the mistakes or the way that it was already starting to take shape in the United States. I think in Canada, this dialogue has been opened with, look, home funeral guides are not rising in opposition to funeral directors. The movement is simply about re-educating people that they have the capacity and the right and obligation and the privilege to reclaim the care of their own dead, and that there's people out there that can help them do it in whatever way is right for them, whether it's working with someone who might be an Indigenous Canadian who has experience with at-home death care, who can, help them or give them some advice or say what it was like for them. Or maybe they look for services from a home funeral guide or a death doula to kind of teach them these are your rights, this is what you can do. Or maybe they go through normal, funeral service and get some traditional services, but with the awareness that they're reaching out for those services, not that they're being sort of forced upon them in a cookie cutter type way. So that's another really big advantage, I think, in Canada is the dialogue between the movement and the existent service providers. I think is a lot more collaborative. I think collaboration is a really important piece that we have going for us here in Canada.
Part of the work that I've been involved in Ontario has been to provide services essentially for people who are under like social assistance. So it's really where the government steps in and essentially pays a provider to essentially bury the unclaimed. And that's kind of it sounds harsh, but that's kind of really what it is. And it's a really special thing to do. Although, sometimes you can be driving super far to this cemetery and, the service is, a quick 15-minute graveside service and you're on your way and, you're doing it on a volunteer basis. And that's really where I think it's interesting that the community comes together because, on one end, these people who don't really have family or who have family who can't even afford, any type of death care practices, they can't really have that community death care because they just don't have the capacity. But then you have sort of this community of strangers almost that come together. So it's an interesting thing. And, I'm bringing this up because it's something that I've been personally kind of dealing with, where it's like,
Yeah.
in some ways we almost need funeral directors to step in and do this because they have the ability to do it when sometimes the community doesn't even know that there's a person in need. So it's like,
Yeah.
and that's where I think that there's like
Yeah.
a connection between the two.
This whole idea of accessibility, really. I mean, that's what that's about to me is how is death care accessible or not accessible to people? What are the barriers? And I think, socioeconomic barriers are a big one. And how does that change the picture? How does that change the practice? And, let's look at some other barriers that are in place. We look at sexual orientation. There's been a lot of comments about that, especially in the States, about service providers not being willing to serve some groups of people. So I think this whole idea of barriers to death caring and looking at it too from a community oriented perspective, just even our lifestyle, how our society has changed, the fact that children aren't necessarily so based and focused around the home anymore. Perhaps they're spread out geographically. So who is coming together to collect to do these things? Yeah, lots of good meat to chew on in there, that's for sure.
And it also speaks to the effect that the rising cost of funerals takes on lower income families because they literally can't afford to have like even just any type of service, even a cremation for their loved one. And the province has to step in, but at the same time it's an injustice because they're unable to have a service that they would necessarily want for their loved one. So yeah, it's a really tough situation, and it's been something that I've been sort of dealing with recently, and I appreciate your comments on that. It's interesting.
Yeah, totally. The whole idea of like funeral poverty and what that kind of gets me thinking is when you look at the description of what hospice palliative care is supposed to include in Canada. Like if you go to their national website and they say hospice palliative care is this is what falls under the umbrella. And I'll misquote it, but it's something to do with serving patients and their family as the unit of care from the time of diagnosis and to bereavement. So to me, that's so interesting because how have we then got a public healthcare system that seeks to care for people throughout that whole pan-death spectrum, and yet this one piece of the pie has been handed off to private industry? Like, how has that happened? That's pretty interesting when you think about it. And another way of kind of looking at it is then I start to wonder from a healthcare and broader economic perspective, I start to wonder about things like MAID or things like death doulas. How are we being brought into the healthcare movement, when you look at the stakes that are at play, when you look at the economics of it, I mean, I was invited as a death midwife. That's the hat that I was wearing. I was invited to a meeting in BC where they were looking at, reimagining hospice palliative care, and there was like CEOs of hospitals and major academic institutions there. I'm like, how is little old me? Like, I'm not even part of a group. Like, I'm just claiming to be a death midwife and that this is what I do. How am I a stakeholder in this? But I realized that this is why. It's because the message I'm spreading is you can do it yourself. And healthcare essentially needs people to reclaim death care because financially we need people to be taking care of one another again because the system's about to break, right? Like, we can't afford to go forward the way we have. So we basically need people to reclaim the care of their own dying and dead because we can't afford for them not to. So I think it's that, to me, is super interesting because then these movements come into an alignment in such an unexpected way, right? It's not this kind of idealistic philosophical way where I'm kind of coming from immediately, and yet we find this different resonance. Like, that's fascinating. And just this whole idea that the funeral industry is a privatized industry, that Canadians believe that you can't die without getting this private service, is pretty interesting to get your head around too.